Hello, these are your Power of Change notes. These are the evolution notes in Unit 7.3. Obviously, I'm recording these notes on a school spirit day, so forgive the hat. As you guys take notes today, these are going to be your notes that will take you through the concept of evolution. There will be some drawing involved today, and you might want a couple of different colors of writing utensils in order to help you with your notes. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. If you didn't quite get it, just pause the video and complete your notes before you move on. Oop, except I pushed the wrong button. Let me try again. All right, so first, what is evolution? So evolution just means change over time, but change that's caused for some specific reasons. First off, the change could be caused by a mutation in the genetics of a group of animals. It could be something that's happening just because of natural selection as animals randomly breed and grow in their environment. Over time, some changes are made because that's how sexual selection works. Or sometimes there's also genetic drift, just the nature of how one generation breeds to the next generation. Over time, the genetics will kind of meander this way and meander back the other way. As you guys think about evolution, though, all I really want you to think is that it's just how a population of wild animals change over time. That's the main goal. All right, so why do animals evolve in the first place? And primarily, it's driven by their environment. When something changes in an animal's environment, the animals will either be successful or they won't. And the ones that are more successful are the ones that are going to be able to pass their genetics on to the next generation. And therefore, if those animals had some unique traits about them, those unique traits are going to get passed on. So over time, you get this change in the genetics as animals that are the best fit, the most successful in their environment are able to breed, those traits get passed on and the animals adapt over time. And all that we mean by adaptation is it's the process by which the animals change in response to those environmental conditions. So when we think about evolution, there are several factors that can cause genetic shifts, and those are going to be defined on the next page. So the first one is mutation. So mutations is just spontaneous changes in DNA. This is literally just as you are coding the DNA, you're copying over the DNA in the cells, something gets flip-flopped in those big long letter sequences. And that means that maybe an enzyme changes or a protein that used to be coded this way is now coded this way. And those sorts of changes over time can cause some significant changes in a population, but it takes a really, really, really long time. The next one is migration. This is just animals moving from one population to another. It's not so much like the yearly migration that animals go through. It's more like a permanent migration. Like these goats left this region and entered this region like permanently. That's what we mean by migration. Next, we have population size. When populations of animals get small, the breeding choices are limited, and that means that unique genetics are going to be pushed faster. It also means that you're going to get more mutation because when inbreeding happens, you get changes happening very quickly. That's actually how we have all of our domestic breeds of animals, is that we inbreed them. Next up, you have random mating, which is when there is no sexual selection. So just boy meets girl in the wild, and you get a new generation of critters. There's no options, or they're not choosing mates based on sound or smell or coloration. If none of that is happening, you have true random mating. And then finally, selection is just that there's no environmental influence or preferences taking place. It's just random, natural selection. Things are just selecting as you go through. All right, so next up we want to look at some common populations. So the first thing that we need to clarify is that not all organisms on the planet are evolving. There are organisms and populations of animals and plants that are experiencing genetic equilibrium or no evolution. And that's when most individuals within the community have an average trait. Yes, you still have, some that have an extreme trait, but most of them are average, and it remains the same from generation to generation. It may be like that for hundreds of years or millions of years for that particular organism. And if that's the case, they're at equilibrium and there's no evolution taking place. The example here with these bees is that you have an average size bee body size. You have some small bees, you have some big bees, but over the long haul, these bees, if they're at genetic equilibrium, are mostly staying the same size from one generation to the next. Okay, so next we just have to review who we're talking about when we talk about the science of evolution. We are, of course, talking about Charles Darwin. He's a scientist that's credited with evolutionary theory, but he is definitely not the only scientist who was working on evolution at the time. Darwin's theory had many components to it. There are some pieces of it that we threw away because they were crazy, wrong, and weird, honestly. But there are two pieces of Charles Darwin's theory that are widely accepted by the scientific community because they're supported with lots and lots of scientific evidence from all over the world. So the two pieces of Charles' theory that matter to us are that animals descend with modification through the fossil record. So we can look at really, really old fossils and compare them to newer fossils and find those similarities and assume that there is some relation. And then that relationship also means that we can look at current animals that are living and well and draw some similar conclusions about if those animals are related. Now, they may be very distantly related, but if they have some similar traits, they had to have had a common ancestor at some point in time. So that's the concept of descent with modification, and that's widely accepted around the world. The other option, or the other piece of Charles's theory that is widely accepted, is that there's modification through natural selection. So that these changes are happening naturally in the environment, where the assumption is that there's not a force that's enacting these pieces, that it's just this is how animals live in their environment, and that pushes things over time. All right, so next up, we want to talk a little bit about natural selection because there's sometimes some confusion about that term. All that we mean by natural selection is that organisms that are best suited for their environment are going to be really successful. And if you're a healthy, successful, well-fed organism, you're likely to find a mate, breed, and pass your genetics on to the next generation of organisms. So what we mean by survival of the fittest is not like survival of the strongest animal. We mean survival of the types of traits or the types of genetics that make an animal most successful in their environment. So they're fittest, like they fit like a puzzle piece in their environment, not fittest, they're big, burly plants and animals. Okay? All right, so then let's talk about some of the different ways that genetics moves and changes over time. So the first one is stabilizing selection. This is really similar to no genetic drift or no, genetic equilibrium or no evolution, except that from generation to generation, we're getting more and more and more and more of the average trait, which means that that population is stabilizing to that average piece. So we graph that as you see below. It's like we took our red original equilibrium population of bees, but from one generation to the next, we're seeing fewer and fewer big bees and fewer little bees, and many, many more of those average bees. So if we saw that happening in the data as we observed generations of bees, then we would say that they were stabilizing in their evolution. So they are evolving, but they're evolving to be more and more average. The next type is directional selection. And directional selection is where an extreme trait, for whatever reason, now makes an organism more successful. So for our bee example here, let's say something happened in their environment, and now suddenly it is a big advantage to be a big bee. Maybe a new predator came in, and it can fit all the average bees and the little bees into its mouth, but it can't fit the big bee in its mouth. Suddenly, big bees are going to survive over the other sizes, right? And over many generations, if that predator stays around, the entire population of bees is going to start to shift to be slightly bigger and bigger bees. Not because the bees decided, hey, it's a good idea to be bigger, but because the big bees lived long enough to pass on their genetics, so they get bigger over time. The next type of selection is a weird one. This is disruptive selection, and this is where something new happens in the environment and it wipes out the average trait. So organisms that have any extreme trait are going to be more likely to survive than that average trait. So you can see that graph here below, and that with our bee population, we would have the little bees would have an advantage, the big bees would have an advantage, but all those average bees are probably not having a great life. They're probably dead. So over time, if something comes into a population and wipes out all your average traits, maybe there's some sort of event, a geologic event, something like that, and now you've got only the extreme traits left, then those populations can diversify and you're going to see some changes in their genetics over time. Another type of evolution that we have to talk about is sexual selection. So this is not random mating. This is when animals, and this is generally animals only, are going to be selecting their mates based on some characteristic. Maybe it's colorful tails, maybe it's the scent, maybe it's their behavior. And some of our animals in South Dakota, it's things like they can crash their heads together better than others, or they're the stronger species when they fight. Those sorts of desired traits, because they're desired by the females, end up giving those males greater reproductive success. And over generations and generations, you get those traits being favored. And that's actually how we get to the peacock. We start out probably with birds that didn't have that many shiny feathers or that long of feathers, but after many, many generations of female peacocks preferring giant tail feathers and lots of bright colors, we now have the peacock we know today that is very brightly colored and has a massive, massive tail. So that is sexual selection. Now, sexual selection can push a population in a directional way. So it could be graphed the same as any of the graphs that we looked at today, but the cause won't be natural selection, it will be sexual selection. Another thing that can push populations sometimes is if populations occur in isolation. So if something happened to isolate the species genetically from another group, then you're going to start to see changes in those different groups. So isolation is defined as just that similar species adapt to different environments to become less similar over time. There's two primary ways that you can be isolated genetically. One that is kind of obvious and one that's maybe a little trickier to understand. So geographic isolation is one. So if you like took an island and then something happened and that island split in two, the same lizards that were living on the same island are now living on the two islands, but those lizards are going to now only be able to share genetics with the lizards on their island. And so over time, they're going to change, right? Another good example is the one listed here, which is different like tidal pools or tidal ponds. If those tidal ponds can't share genetics, they're isolated geographically. They might only be 2 feet apart, but if they can't get to the other pond, can't share genetics, so they're isolated. But another way that you can be isolated is actually reproductive isolation, which is more about time. So if you think about types of animals, if they only become able to be bred in, say, the spring, but then you have a similar species that's only able to breed in the fall, even though they might live in the same geographic space, they might be very similarly related and potentially be able to exchange genetics. Because one is only able to get pregnant in the spring and one is only able to get pregnant in the fall, they can never share those genetics, right? Like the males from the fall population and the males from the spring population are never going to be able to donate to the other type of female. So they can be isolated in time in addition to isolated in geography. So when we think about evolution, we're really just thinking about how animals change over time. And we are going to be looking at some tools to help you understand that. Your next assignment is to help you look at some real world scenarios and draw out some graphs that relate the notes that you have today and to kind of help you apply how those would work in the real world. I just want you to work through those and explain them. So on the left side, you're going to graph. On the right side, write an explanation for me. You can, as long as you have a good explanation, you could easily interpret these scenarios in many, many different ways. So just explain how you are interpreting it in addition to drawing your graph. Next time or later in our studies, we'll get into some other tools that we use to help us understand how these different species could potentially be related. And specifically, we're going to learn how to use something called a cladogram. So thank you for your notes today, and I hope you guys have a lovely day. Catch you next time.